Hey everyone, welcome to my channel where the strange, the unexplained, and the downright creepy come to life. From real-life encounters with the paranormal to bizarre, true stories that'll keep you up at night, I bring you the eerie tales you won't hear anywhere else. If you're into late-night chills, mysterious happenings, and things that go bump in the night, you're in the right place. Subscribe, buckle up, and let's dive into the unknown. Half the price of comparable properties. I should have known better, but skepticism has always been my armor against the world's endless capacity for deception. Ghost stories, spiritual cleansings, the locals whispered warnings about certain addresses. It all struck me as elaborate theater designed to separate tourists from their money. The house sat on a narrow cobblestone street, where afternoon shadows stretched long and dark between buildings that had witnessed 4 centuries of human struggle. Its walls were thick limestone, painted in that particular shade of colonial yellow that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The real estate agent, a nervous woman who kept glancing at her watch, hurried through the walkthrough with practiced efficiency, her heels clicking against the ceramic tiles that covered every surface like geometric skin. Those tiles would become my obsession. The first week passed without incident. I worked from the small study overlooking the interior courtyard, where a dry fountain sat surrounded by untended plants that rustled without wind. The house settled around me with the groans and sighs of old wood and older stones, sounds I attributed to thermal expansion and the weight of accumulated years. My laptop screen provided the only modern light in rooms where electric bulbs seemed to cast shadows more than illumination. I had rented the place for 3 months, long enough to complete the research project that had brought me to Colombia, academic work on colonial trade routes. Dry, methodical stuff that required no belief in anything beyond documented facts and economic patterns. The irony wasn't lost on me later. It was on the 8th day, at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that everything changed. I had been reviewing shipping manifests from the 1700s when the temperature in the study dropped so suddenly that my breath became visible. Not just cool, the kind of cold that reaches into your bones and makes your teeth ache. But here's what defied explanation. The cold didn't fill the room, followed me. When I stood and moved toward the window, the sphere of frigid air moved with me, as if I carried winter in my clothes. That's when I saw him. A figure walked across the main room, visible through the study's open doorway, tall, wearing what looked like period clothing, a dark coat that might have been fashionable 3 centuries ago. He moved with purpose, crossing from the front entrance toward the kitchen in a straight line, never looking in my direction. His footsteps made no sound on the ceramic tiles, but I could see each one as a brief distortion in the air, like heat waves in reverse. The cold followed his path. I called out, not a greeting, but that wordless sound people make when they're startled. The figure didn't pause or turn. He simply continued his trajectory until he passed beyond my line of sight. And then the temperature returned to normal, so abruptly I wondered if I had imagined the entire episode. Except for what I discovered next. Curiosity overrode caution, and I followed the route the figure had taken. Each tile where he had stepped was cracked. Not shattered or broken, but marked with hairline fractures that formed patterns I recognized from my research. Colonial symbols used to mark property boundaries and trade agreements. A stylized compass rose, a merchant seal, what looked like a simplified map of the Caribbean islands. I knelt and traced the cracks with my fingertip. They were real, cold to the touch, and definitely fresh. The cement between the tiles was still damp with a moisture that shouldn't have existed in a house that had been empty for months. The rational part of my mind began its defensive work immediately. Old houses settled unpredictably. Temperature changes could cause ceramic to crack in unexpected patterns. My eyes, tired from hours of screen work, could have created visual patterns where none existed. The human brain excelled at finding meaning in randomness. But rationality couldn't explain the cold that had moved with me, or the absolute clarity with which I had seen a man who cast no shadow. That night, I called my sister in Boston. Not to discuss what had happened, I wasn't ready to voice it. Wasn't ready to hear my own words describe something impossible. But because I needed to hear a familiar voice. Needed to anchor myself to a world where colonial ghosts didn't walk through rented houses. She mentioned that I sounded tired, asked if I was eating well, reminded me to get enough sleep. Normal concerns that felt precious in their mundane simplicity. When she asked if everything was all right, I almost told her. Almost. Instead, I assured her that Cartagena was beautiful, and my work was progressing well. Both statements felt like lies. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The house seemed more alive in darkness, filled with sounds that old buildings make. Settling wood, shifting stones, the distant murmur of the Caribbean breeze through shutters. But underneath those explainable noises, I began to notice others. Footsteps that followed no pattern. By afternoon, I could map the exact pattern of doors creaking open and closed in rooms I'd already checked. The soft whisper of fabric brushing against the walls pulled my attention until I listened with such intensity it made my ears ring. I strained to parse real sounds from the paranoid distortions of a fraying mind. Every creak became significant, every silence pregnant with a threat. By morning, I had convinced myself that stress and isolation were distorting my perception. A few days immersed in historical texts about colonial cruelty and exploitation, of course my subconscious would begin projecting. The mind is a brilliant machine for generating meaning, especially when that meaning aligns with deep-rooted anxiety. I told myself to forget what had happened, focus on the work. That resolve lasted until 3 p.m. This time I was ready. I sat in the main room where I had a view of the entire space. My laptop shut, my attention fixed. At precisely 3 p.m., the cold returned. It began as a slow crawl along my spine, then fanned outward like spilled liquid nitrogen, forming a sphere of unnatural chill that defied every law of thermodynamics. He appeared again. Same location near the entrance. Same long coat. Same measured, silent pace. But this time I saw more. Fear hadn't smothered my senses yet. His face, drawn, almost skeletal, bore lines etched by relentless strain, not age. His eyes never wavered from their destination. He walked like someone tracing an old, memorized route, directed by an internal compass. When he reached the far edge of the room, where the hallway swallowed him from sight, he stopped. He turned. He looked at me. His eyes carried centuries, not of wisdom, but exhaustion. The deep, immovable fatigue of someone who had walked too long without reprieve. When our gazes locked, the cold thickened. My hands shook. Something passed between us, not a message, but a recognition. He knew I could see him, and I knew, in the way you know a nightmare is real before you wake, that I wasn't the first to witness this march. Then he turned and continued on, leaving behind fresh fractures in the ceramic floor tiles. New symbols, unfamiliar patterns. When the temperature normalized, I was trembling. Not from the cold, but from the raw, primal fear that strikes when the seams of reality unravel. I took photos of the new cracks and spent the rest of the afternoon combing through references to colonial-era symbols. They matched codes used by merchants during the Spanish occupation to mark safe passage routes. But these weren't routes. They were warnings, disputed territories, places where multiple authorities claimed control, where travelers could vanish into legal ambiguity. My rationality began to feel thin. A worn gauze stretched across something vast and insistent. Something was trying to reach me, through broken tile and unnatural cold. That evening I wandered the old quarter, hoping fresh air and the presence of real people would tether me back to normality. Cartagena buzzed with life. Vendors, tourists, children playing football in sun-soaked plazas. Every wall, every step, touched by golden Caribbean light, as if sunlight itself could erase dark thoughts. I stopped at a tiny cafe where an elderly man served coffee strong enough to raise the dead. When I mentioned the address where I was staying, his expression changed. He regarded me with the focused caution usually reserved for those exhibiting madness. He asked if I'd noticed anything strange in the house. The question hovered, thick as smoke. I could have lied, dismissed it with a laugh. But instead, I told him the cold, the figure, the broken tiles. He nodded, unsurprised, as if I'd just confirmed what he already feared. Then he told me about Don Eduardo Herrera, a colonial merchant, wealthy, powerful, owner of the very house I now occupied. In the 1740s, Herrera thrived on Caribbean trade, but his prosperity came at a cost. He made accommodations with authorities beyond official channels, agreements that demanded silence, compromises that required him to ignore the horrific, to walk the same trusted paths even when they led nowhere. The old man's tale didn't end with Herrera's death. It ended with his inability to stop walking. I thanked him both for the coffee and the story, treating them as equivalent comforts. But on my way back through the dimming streets, his words stalked me like footsteps I could almost hear. That night, I dreamed of trade routes that threaded through dimensions, not geography, of merchants who trafficked in more than goods, of systems that created debts too vast for death to cancel. I woke with an unshakable certainty. Someone had been watching me sleep, but when I turned on the lights, the room was empty, except for the faint scent of wool and the sea. I waited for 3 o'clock with the anticipation of a researcher on the verge of a significant discovery. I had prepared, camera ready, notebook open, every sense focused on documenting what happened. The cold arrived on schedule, and so did he, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 figures walked the path in single file, each separated by perhaps 50 years of fashion. The first wore Herrera's dark coat. The second was dressed in the style of the early 1800s. The third wore a suit that might have been fashionable in the 1920s. All followed the same route with the same mechanical precision, their footsteps leaving the same symbolic cracks in tiles that already bore the accumulated marks of previous passages. The cold was no longer localized to my position. It filled the entire room, turning my breath visible and making my skin burn with the kind of pain that comes from touching dry ice. When the procession reached the point where they would normally disappear from view, all 3 stopped and turned to look at me. Their eyes held the same exhausted recognition I had seen before, but multiplied. They weren't just tired. They were drowning in repetition, trapped in a cycle that demanded they keep walking the same path while reality slowly cracked around them. The youngest of the 3, the man in the 1920s suit, opened his mouth as if to speak. No sound emerged, but I understood anyway. The message wasn't delivered through words, but through the sudden knowledge that appeared in my mind like a file downloaded directly into my consciousness. They weren't ghosts. They were still alive, still walking, still trying to complete a journey that had begun 3 centuries ago and would continue for 3 centuries more. The house wasn't haunted. It was a way station, a checkpoint on a route that existed parallel to the normal world, intersecting with it only at specific times and places. And I was being invited to join them. The realization came with a package of additional knowledge I neither wanted nor could reject. The route they walked wasn't limited to this house. It extended throughout the colonial world, connecting points where the old trade networks had operated outside normal legal frameworks. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, in hundreds of locations across the Caribbean, South America, and Spain, these merchants continued their work, carrying goods that couldn't be described and serving customers who paid in currencies that had no names. The invitation wasn't optional. My presence in the house, my ability to see them, the fact that I had witnessed their passage 3 times, all of it meant I had been selected for recruitment into a system that predated and would outlast any government or economy. I understood. The cracks in the tiles weren't symbols. They were a map, and I was being asked to learn the route. The 3 figures waited with infinite patience while I processed this information. The cold had become a living thing that pressed against my skin and filled my lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. Time moved differently in their presence. Seconds stretched into hours while the world outside the house continued at normal speed. I could feel my resistance weakening, not through force, but through the slow erosion of my certainty about what was real and what was possible. The skepticism that had always protected me began to feel like just another form of self-deception, a comfortable lie that ignored the evidence of my own senses. But some part of me, the part that had always questioned authority and refused easy answers, recognized that this was how it happened. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual acceptance of the impossible. One small compromise at a time. First you see them, then you understand them, then you join them, and once you start walking their route, You never stop. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, using the time to choose between sanity and truth, between the safe world I understood and the dangerous one that actually existed. When I opened them, the figures were gone. The temperature had returned to normal. The tiles showed no new cracks, but the knowledge remained, sitting in my mind like a seed, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. I packed my belongings that night and left Cartagena the next morning, 3 weeks before my rental was scheduled to end. The real estate agent seemed unsurprised when I called to explain my early departure. She didn't ask for details. Now I'm back in Boston, writing this account while sitting in my university office, where fluorescent lights burn away shadows and reality operates according to rules I can verify and trust. My research project was completed using digital archives and secondary sources. I never returned to the colonial quarter. Never walked those cobblestone streets where afternoon shadows stretch between buildings that remember too much. But every day at 3 p.m., no matter where I am, I feel a subtle chill along my spine and catch myself looking for cracks in whatever floor I'm standing on. The knowledge they gave me hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown stronger, more insistent, accompanied by a growing certainty that my early departure was not an escape, but a postponement. The invitation remains open. The route continues to exist, connecting points across space and time where commerce operates according to older rules than supply and demand. And somewhere, in a yellow house in Cartagena, the ceramic tiles are still cracking. Thin hairline fractures unfurl in lines I try not to follow too closely, because some of them resemble maps, routes no living person should ever have to walk. I keep telling myself it was stress, isolation, a mind immersed too long in colonial history, turned inward by silence and overwork. The power of suggestion grafted onto coincidence. That's all. I've returned to my routine, my apartment, my rational worldview. I give lectures again, grade papers, sip tea while dismissing anything that can't be measured or tested. My old skepticism fits like a coat I can wear in public. But at night, late, when the world softens and theories go threadbare, I remember the weight of centuries that looked back at me through those exhausted eyes. And I wonder how long I can keep pretending I don't believe what I already know. Lately, the bathroom tiles have begun to change. Hairline cracks snake across the surface, fresh, impossibly fine. Not enough to raise concern, not yet. But I've stopped examining them closely. They don't form a pattern I can name. Not yet. But some roots, once exposed, keep growing in directions you can't ignore. Not forever. Story 2, Devil's Backbone. The clay felt wrong under my fingertips. It was cold in a way that didn't make sense. Deeply, internally cold, like something had drawn all the warmth out of the hillside. I should have turned back when I felt it, but I'd driven 3 hours to get there. And pride is a quiet but stubborn companion. The locals call it Devil's Backbone, a sheer red clay cliff rising from the Appalachian foothills like a snapped bone trying to pierce the sky. That morning, mist clung low to the tree-line and the silence was so total it erased everything. Birdsong, insects, even the sound of my own breath. I started climbing. Every step triggered little avalanches that rattled down into the mist below. The clay shifted unpredictably beneath my boots, but I pressed on. About 20 minutes into the climb, I felt it, that unmistakable pressure between the shoulders, the sense of being watched. I froze, pressed myself to the cliff and glanced down. The trail had vanished in the fog. There was nothing, but I could feel the stare of something unseen, close, deliberate. I climbed higher. The clay changed texture. Gritty now, threaded with dark specks that weren't just dirt. I brought my fingers closer to examine it. The specks looked organic, old, like something that had once been alive and had left only fragments behind. Then the wind shifted, carried a smell I hadn't expected, metallic and sharp, like wet copper. It hit something in my memory, not a moment, but a mood, childhood fear. My stomach clenched. As I climbed, the watching presence didn't go away, it grew bolder. It was studying me, measuring me, not like prey, like a candidate. I tried to stay focused, but the shadows moved at the edge of my vision, shaped themselves into things that weren't there when I looked directly. The clay crumbled more easily now. I tested every hold twice. Then it happened. My foot slipped. Just a little, but enough. I lurched. My left hand reached for a bad hold and gave way. For one long second, I hung there, pack pulling me back, arms trembling, the cliff face inches from my nose, and then a hand warm, unmistakably human, pressed firmly against the center of my back. Not yanking, not shoving, just enough to steady me. I scrambled forward, found a hold, pulled myself up, heart hammering, lungs burning. I turned, expecting someone, another climber, a ranger, anyone, but there was nothing. No ropes, no gear, just empty cliff and a long drop into fog. Then I heard it, boots on rock, faint but clear. Above me, someone walking along the cliff face, moving down. Measured steps, no panic, no voice. I started climbing again, fast now, driven by something more than fear. The footsteps kept pace. I paused, they paused. I moved, they moved, not following, mirroring. The last 20 feet were a scramble. The clay was dry and loose, flaking away at a touch. I lunged from hold to hold, hoping momentum would beat gravity. The footsteps stopped, but the sense of being watched returned, heavier now, intimate, as if the thing watching me had leaned in close. When I finally pulled myself over the lip and onto the summit, I collapsed. My legs refused to move. The sky above was colorless and flat. The silence up here was absolute. Too absolute. I lay there for a long time, breathing, listening, because I knew, somewhere close, just beyond the edge, someone was still standing there, watching. I rolled over and pushed myself to my feet, brushing off the dirt and surveying the summit. It was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 20 feet across, sparsely covered in tufts of dry grass and a few stunted trees that clawed at the rocky soil like survivors. But what seized my attention immediately were the boot prints. They were clear, fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth near the cliff's edge. Military-style boots, judging by the tread size 11 or 12, I guessed. The tracks began about 10 feet from where I'd pulled myself over the lip, as if their maker had materialized from thin air. They led in a straight line across the summit to the opposite side, toward the drop. I followed them, scalp prickling, my breath shallow. The prints were too perfect. No sign of age or erosion. No wind-blown dust. No disturbance from wildlife. As if they'd been stamped there minutes ago. Each one deep, defined, the stride steady and purposeful. Someone carrying gear. Maybe equipment that might explain their presence out here. But the more I studied them, the less sense they made. The trail led directly to the cliff's edge. Not the sloped path I'd climbed, but the sheer drop, a vertical wall of red clay plunging into the mist. And there, right at the brink, the prints stopped. The last one perched at the rim, the toe hanging slightly over empty air. I crept closer, heart thudding, and peered over. Nothing. No ledges, no footholds, no ropes. Just the flat vertical face I'd ascended. The final boot print was perfectly formed, as if the wearer had stood suspended over the void. A chill swept through me, physical and immediate. No one could have made that print and survived. It defied gravity, logic, physics, everything. But it was there, real, tangible, a mark left by something that couldn't exist. I backed away, mind spinning, the hand on my back during the climb. The footsteps, the impossible tracks, all of it pointed to a presence, not just unseen but unnatural. Then I saw them. Small metallic objects scattered near the boot prints, half buried in the dirt. I crouched and brushed the soil away. A tarnished brass button surfaced, bearing an unfamiliar military insignia, cold to the touch, colder than the surrounding ground, and when I picked it up, my fingers tingled, as if it were humming with stored electricity. Near the button, more fragments, a strip of rotted olive drab fabric, a corroded buckle that might have belonged to a rucksack or utility belt, and a set of dog tags, barely legible, the letters worn to ghosts. I squinted. Only partial words remained. PFC, 1952, missing. I sat back, stunned. 70 years ago. If the gear had belonged to the one who made those prints, then whoever had steadied me during my climb had died decades earlier. I tried to rationalize. Altitude sickness, stress, some waking dream, but the evidence was right there, cold and undeniable, gleaming beneath my fingertips. This wasn't hallucination. This wasn't suggestion. Someone had been with me. The wind picked up stronger now. It howled across the summit with a low, keening note that might have been voices. And in that wind, I heard it. The soft jingle of metal gear, the creak of old leather, the slow, deliberate cadence of boots on stone. I turned. Nothing. No one. Yet I felt him. That same unseen presence, closer now. Watching. Waiting. Then came the cold. It rolled outward from the boot prints, spreading across the summit like frostbite in bloom. The grass silvered with rime. The rocks popped and cracked under the sudden pressure of freezing moisture. My breath came out in misty plumes. I stumbled back, but stopped. Something was behind me. Not something I could see, but something solid. The air itself resisted me, pushed against me like a hand. The same hand that had held me on the cliff face. I froze. That's when I saw him. Not clearly, never clearly, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. A shimmer of movement, like heat haze, but in reverse, colder than the air around it. He stood exactly where the boot prints ended. A shape forming, not quite material. A young man in fatigues, maybe, but the details slipped away when I looked straight at him. Still, I knew. He had been watching me all along. Not just today. Perhaps long before I ever stepped foot on the trail. Evaluating me, testing me, measuring something I couldn't name. That hand on my back. It hadn't been a reflex. It was a decision. But why? What made me worthy of his intervention? Or had others before me received the same silent protection? Was there a pattern? A roster of names going back to the day he died? And if so, what was he still guarding? The questions multiplied, fracturing my thoughts. If he was real, if he was the ghost of a soldier lost in 1952, then what was he waiting for? What kept him here, frozen to this clifftop? The wind died. Silence crashed down like a curtain, thick and pressing. And in that utter stillness, I felt something shift. Something was coming. Something he hadn't been guarding me from. Something he had been guarding me for. I heard something then. Something that nearly stopped my heart. A soft whisper of my name, spoken in a voice like distant radio static. He knew who I was. He'd been waiting for me. The realization hit like a punch to the chest, and my knees gave way beneath me. This wasn't a random encounter with some aimless spirit. It was a planned meeting, an appointment I had unknowingly kept by choosing to climb Devil's Backbone on this particular day. But planned by whom? And for what purpose? The shadow moved, took a single step forward, one that should have sent him plummeting over the cliff's edge. Instead, it brought him closer. His form grew more defined, solidifying just enough for me to glimpse terrible, heartbreaking details. The same military insignia as on the button I'd found, the same unit markings from the corroded dog tags. And his face, when the shifting shadows allowed me a clear view, bore an expression of such deep loneliness it stole the breath from my lungs. This wasn't a malevolent spirit or a vengeful ghost. This was a young man who had died far from home, a soldier who had stood watch on this clifftop for 70 years, waiting for someone who would finally understand what he was trying to protect. Me. The knowledge didn't arrive through logic. It wasn't reasoned or guessed. It settled in me, sudden and certain, like a key sliding into a lock. I was the one he'd been waiting for, the one who would see past the impossibility of his existence and grasp the truth hidden beneath it. But what truth? What secret was worth a 70-year vigil atop a desolate summit? The answer came not in words or visions, but in a shift in perception, a lifting of fog from my thoughts. The artifacts strewn around me weren't random debris from a long-forgotten mission. They were breadcrumbs, left deliberately for someone with the clarity to read them. The dog tags read, 1952, the year the Korean War was raging, when young men vanished into mountains and valleys overseas, many never to return. But this wasn't Korea. This was Appalachia, thousands of miles from any battlefield. So why was a soldier stationed here, in this remote corner of American wilderness? Unless the realization clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The missing person reports from the early 50s. The whispered stories of government experiments in these hills. The rumors of classified projects gone wrong, covered up hastily, buried deep beneath layers of lies. I dismissed it all. Folklore, the kind of conspiracy that thrives in isolated places, where imagination fills in for a lack of facts. But what if it was real? What if something happened here in 1952? Something so catastrophic it had to be buried, its witnesses silenced, its remnants guarded. And what if this soldier had been stationed to do exactly that, to stand watch over whatever they'd locked away? The shadow figure nodded, slow and solemn. He was clearer now, solid enough that I could see the weight pressing down on him. Exhaustion etched into his posture, the burden of decades hanging from his shoulders. He had fulfilled his orders without question, had guarded this place, this secret, without fail. But now he was ready to pass it on, to someone who could carry it forward, someone willing to protect what could never be revealed, even if it meant giving up everything else, even if it meant sacrificing a normal life for a responsibility no one would understand. I wanted to refuse. Every sane instinct begged me to walk away, but deep inside I already knew. Some secrets are too dangerous to be shared, some truths too volatile to expose, and I'd made my choice before I ever heard the voice, when I decided to climb this cliff on this exact day. The wind returned, distant thunder rumbling through the trees, and when it passed, I was alone. The shadow figure was gone, leaving behind only boot prints and scattered relics. But I felt him still, not vanished, just integrated. A presence folded into my own thoughts, like a silent passenger preparing for a long journey. I gathered the artifacts with trembling hands, wrapping them carefully in my spare shirt before tucking them into my pack. Evidence of something I no longer had the words to explain. Evidence of something that had to stay hidden. Something that now required me to protect it. The descent took twice as long, not due to the terrain, but because I kept looking back, searching for movement among the trees. I saw nothing, but I knew I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Not by hostile eyes now, but by grateful ones. The sensation followed me all the way to my car and stayed with me through the long drive home. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've returned to Devil's Backbone 17 times. Always alone, always carrying the artifacts I found on that first visit. When people ask, I tell them I'm studying local geology, researching erosion patterns for a paper I'll never write. They accept the explanation without question, perhaps because something in my manner discourages further inquiry. I've learned things during these visits, fragments of truth that surface in dreams and half-remembered conversations with figures who may or may not exist. The soldier's name was David Kowalski, 19 years old when he died, guarding something that should never have been created. The project had a designation, Operation Midnight Garden, but no official records remain. The participants were sworn to secrecy under threat of prosecution, and most took their knowledge to the grave. But not all. Sometimes, late at night, when the summit is shrouded in fog, other figures join me around the weathered boot prints. Old men mostly, their faces marked by decades of carefully guarded secrets. They speak in whispers about things that should have stayed buried, about experiments that pushed beyond the boundaries of human understanding into territories never meant to be explored. They confirm what I've already begun to suspect. My encounter with David Kowalski was only the beginning. There are other sites scattered across these mountains, other guardians maintaining their vigils over secrets too dangerous to abandon. A network of watchers bound together by knowledge and duty, each one chosen not by chance, but by some quality that makes them suitable keepers of truths that could reshape the world or destroy it. I've stopped asking myself whether I'm losing my sanity. The question has become irrelevant, a luxury I can no longer afford. What matters now is the certainty that some things are more important than personal peace of mind, more vital than the comfortable illusion of a world where the impossible doesn't exist. David Kowalski understood that. He spent 70 years proving it. Now it's my turn. The boot prints are still there when I visit the summit, frozen in the moment of their creation. But they're fainter now, as if his long vigil is finally ending. Soon they'll fade completely, leaving behind only the knowledge of what lies buried beneath this remote clifftop, and the unwavering certainty that it must never be disturbed. I've made my peace with that responsibility. Some guardians are chosen by circumstance, others by fate. A few, like me, are chosen by the Grateful Dead, who can finally rest knowing their duty has been passed to worthy hands. The question that haunts my dreams isn't whether I'm real or imaginary, sane or psychotic. It's simpler and infinitely more disturbing. If I die tomorrow, who will David Kowalski choose to replace me? And what will it cost them to accept? Small bare feet had somehow scaled an 8-foot wall topped with barbed wire, landing silently in my yard and approaching my home while I sat unaware at my desk. But what made my skin crawl was this. The footprints stopped exactly 6 feet from my back door. They didn't circle the house or return to the wall. They simply ended, as if whoever had made them had evaporated into the evening air. Grabbing a flashlight, I examined the tracks more closely. The impressions were deep, detailed, unmistakably real. But as I followed them from the wall toward my house, something impossible became clear. Each step closer to my door, the footprints grew fainter. By the time they reached that 6-foot mark, they were barely visible depressions in the soil, and beyond that point, nothing. Not even disturbed grass where someone might have stepped. Standing in my backyard, flashlight shaking in my hand, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. The sensation was so strong I spun around, sweeping the beam across the yard, the wall, the dark windows of my house. Nothing. But the feeling persisted, a crawling certainty that I was being watched from multiple directions at once. I hurried inside and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The house settling, branches scraping against the roof, the distant hum of the refrigerator. But beneath those normal noises, I kept hearing something else. Soft footsteps on hardwood floors, the quiet creak of stairs. Sounds that could have been the old house adjusting to the October cold, but which my overwrought mind interpreted as someone, or something, moving through the rooms below. The next morning, I called the city planning office. I needed to know more about the lot next door, official confirmation of what I'd seen. The clerk who answered was helpful, but puzzled by my questions about the Riverside Children's Home. She paused, and I heard typing. "I'm not showing any record of that facility in our database. What address are you looking at?" I gave her the street address, described the location, mentioned the vacant lot. More typing, longer pauses. "Sir, according to our records, that lot has been vacant since 1987. It was rezoned for residential development but never built on due to soil conditions. There's no record of any institutional use." After I hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen. The newspaper articles I'd found the night before suddenly seemed less reliable, their details fuzzy in the harsh light of morning. Had I really read about missing children and basement burials, or had my tired mind filled in blanks with its own fears? But the footprints were real. I checked again that morning, and they were still there, still ending at that impossible 6-foot mark. The laughter came again at 3:47 p.m., and this time, I was ready. Phone set to record, shoes by the back door, a plan to document whatever was happening next door. But when the sound began, I found myself frozen at the kitchen window, unable to move, because this time I could see the source. Through the gap in the wall, barely visible in the afternoon shadows, shapes moved among the rectangular depressions in the earth. Small figures, translucent as heat shimmer, playing some silent game between the settled graves. They ran and darted, their movements creating no sound except that impossible laughter, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I watched, phone forgotten in my hand, as one figure approached the wall. Child-sized, wearing what might have been old-fashioned clothing, a simple dress or shirt that moved without wind. As it drew closer to the gap where I crouched watching, details became clearer. But not the details I expected. The figure had no face. Where features should have been was only smooth, blank space, like an unfinished sculpture. Yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, studying me, with that featureless visage tilted in curious observation. We regarded each other through the gap in the wall. The living and the what? Ghost? Hallucination? Manifestation of guilt over children I'd never known? Then it raised one small hand and pressed it against the wall, directly over the gap. On my side of the brick barrier, I felt a sudden, shocking cold. My breath misted in the warm October air. Frost began forming on the mortar around the opening. I stumbled backward, my phone finally slipping from numb fingers to shatter on the patio stones. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it made my ears ring. But in that silence, I heard something else. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across stone. The sound was coming from inside my house. I turned toward the back door, and there, pressed against the glass, were small handprints. Dozens of them, overlapping, fresh, as if a crowd of children had been trying to get inside while I stood distracted in the yard. The prints covered the glass from top to bottom, some so high they could only have been made by someone floating in the air. But I was looking from the outside. The handprints were on the interior surface of the glass. Whatever had made them was already inside my house. The scratching continued. The scratching sound was like chalk on a blackboard. Unbearable, a noise that made my teeth ache. It moved through the house, deliberate, purposeful. I followed the sound with my eyes, tracking its slow progress through the living room, up the stairs and into my bedroom, where my laptop sat open, filled with everything I had researched about the Riverside Children's Home. Research that, according to the city clerk, documented a facility that had never existed. Standing in my backyard as the October afternoon faded toward evening, I faced a choice no rational person should ever have to make. Confront whatever was making those sounds inside or run, leave everything behind, and flee from a house infected with impossibilities. As I stood there, frozen between fear and logic, I noticed something that decided my fate for me. The footprints in my yard, the ones that had ended 6 feet from my door. They were moving. New impressions appeared in the soft earth, step by step, inching closer, invisible feet crossing my lawn with measured, inevitable progress. I ran for the back door, fumbling with my shaking hands to find the keys. Behind me, the presence seemed to grow nearer. When I finally swung the door open and stumbled inside, I could swear I felt cold breath graze the back of my neck. The scratching stopped, but the house had changed. The air grew thick, heavy, almost suffocating, charged with an energy that made breathing difficult. Every shadow deepened, every corner felt potentially occupied. I moved through my own home like a stranger, checking rooms that somehow felt foreign. Despite containing my furniture, my belongings. In my bedroom, my laptop screen glowed with the articles I had been reading, but the text was different. Where I remembered dark tales of missing children and sinister basement burials, I now found innocent stories of a successful youth facility that had quietly closed due to funding. The anonymous employee's quote about the cellar in the back garden was gone, replaced by a grateful former resident's testimonial. I refreshed the page. The story changed again, this time describing Riverside Children's Home as a model institution free of scandal or tragedy. Another refresh revealed yet another version. A children's home destroyed by fire, residents safely evacuated. Each reload shifted the narrative. The existence and location of the facility on the lot next door remained constant. But the details, the dark rumors, the missing children, and whispered horrors slid like sand through my fingers. Impossible to pin down, impossible to trust. I closed the laptop with trembling hands, trying desperately to think rationally. Stress, fatigue, isolation. Maybe my mind had twisted neighborhood sounds into something sinister. Then I heard it again, that laughter. This time it came from inside the house, upstairs from my bedroom where I had just been sitting. The giggling drifted down the stairs like cold air, the same innocent sound that had started it all. But now it was joined by something else. The soft patter of footsteps on hardwood, the faint creak of floorboards beneath unseen weights. I stood frozen in the living room, listening to invisible children playing in the rooms above my head. Their movements were purposeful, exploring every corner, mapping my home for an unknown reason. Occasionally, I heard whispered voices, too soft to understand but unmistakably communicating. The universal language of childhood games. Logic battled panic. Carbon monoxide poisoning? A gas leak? Something environmental causing hallucinations? I checked the detectors. Normal readings. My phone worked fine when I tried calling for help. But how do you explain to emergency services that your house has been invaded by ghosts? Children who may or may not have ever existed. As night fell, plunging my neighborhood into the deep darkness of October, the sounds upstairs grew more active, as if the approaching night gave them strength, permission to be present in my world. I heard the subtle thud of small feet jumping from bed to floor, drawers opening and closing, furniture shifting in rooms no one should be touching. And through it all, that laughter, echoing, endless, and haunting. But when I climbed the stairs to investigate, I found my bedroom exactly as I'd left it. Bed made, laptop closed, everything in its proper place. The only difference was the temperature. It was noticeably colder upstairs, cold enough that my breath formed small clouds in the air. On my pillow was a deep impression, pressed into the fabric as if someone had been sleeping there. A small head. I backed out of the room and spent the night downstairs, dozing fitfully in my recliner with every light in the house blazing. The sounds continued through the dark hours, footsteps, laughter, the occasional creak of a door opening somewhere in the shadows, but I didn't investigate. I'd learned that searching for the source of these manifestations only raised more questions I couldn't answer. By morning, exhaustion had dulled my fear into a kind of resigned acceptance. Whatever was happening in my house, whatever presence had followed me home from that gap in the wall, it didn't seem malevolent. Disturbing, yes. Impossible to explain, certainly, but not actively threatening. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where this had all begun. The footprints were still there, but now they'd multiplied overnight. Dozens of small impressions covered my lawn, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like crop circles. They wound around the flower beds, spiraled near the tool shed, and formed what might have been hopscotch squares near the back fence. And they all led to the wall. As I watched, sipping coffee that tasted like ashes in my mouth, I saw new footprints appearing in the soft earth. Invisible feet making visible impressions, walking slow circles around my yard as if mapping territory or marking boundaries. The laughter began again at exactly 3:47 p.m. But this time I didn't flinch. I'd been expecting it, waiting for it, almost welcoming it as the only predictable element in a situation that had spiraled far beyond my understanding. I walked outside and approached the wall, no longer caring about rational explanations or logical outcomes. Through the gap in the brick, I could see them more clearly now. Dozens of small figures moving through the overgrown lot, playing among rectangular depressions that might or might not be graves. Some wore old-fashioned clothing. Others seemed dressed in more modern garments, as if representing different eras of the facility's existence. They all had the same blank, featureless faces, but somehow I could sense their emotions, joy, curiosity, a kind of innocent playfulness that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. They seemed aware of my presence, but not threatened by it. If anything, they appeared to be trying to communicate, gesturing toward the settled earth beneath their feet, then pointing toward my house. One of them approached the wall and knelt beside the gap. I watched as it pressed its face close to the opening, and I found myself staring into that smooth, empty visage from just inches away. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we studied each other across the boundary between whatever world they inhabited and the one I thought I knew. Then it spoke, not with words, but a voice that came directly into my mind, clear as my own thoughts but unmistakably foreign. "We've been waiting." The simple statement hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over my own feet in my haste to escape that impossible communication. But the voice followed me, echoing in my skull with patient persistence. "We've been waiting so long, but now you can see us. Now you can help." I ran toward my house, but the voice continued, growing stronger rather than fading with distance. "The others don't understand. They move away, or they ignore us, or they convince themselves we're not real. But you kept looking. You kept listening. You're different. I slammed the back door behind me and pressed my back against it. But there was no escaping the words coming from inside my own mind. We need someone to remember, someone to know what happened here. The truth gets lost. The records change. But the earth remembers. The ground holds our stories. My living room felt like a foreign country. Familiar objects made strange by the presence of thoughts that weren't my own. I stumbled to my laptop and opened it, desperate to document what was happening before I lost my grip on reality completely. But the screen showed only a blank document. Whatever I typed disappeared as soon as I lifted my fingers from the keys, as if the words themselves were being erased by some invisible force. Not that way, the voice whispered. Come back outside. Come and see. Against every instinct, every reasonable thought, I found myself walking back toward the door. The pull was gentle but irresistible, like being led by a trusted friend into unknown territory. The afternoon was fading toward evening again, and in the growing dusk, the lot next door looked different. The overgrown grass had taken on an ethereal quality, seeming to glow with its own soft light. The figures moving among the rectangular depressions were more solid now, more present. I approached the wall and knelt beside the gap. On the other side, a small figure waited for me. Its blank face somehow conveyed infinite patience. Look, it said, and pointed toward the settled earth beneath its feet. As I watched, the rectangular depressions began to change. The earth shifted and settled, revealing outlines unmistakably human. Child-sized forms pressed into the soil, preserved like fossils in stone. But these weren't just impressions. They were monuments, each one marking a life forgotten by official records but remembered by the ground itself. 37, the voice said. 37 children who were never reported missing because we were already missing, already forgotten, already invisible. The truth hit me like a physical weight. The children's home hadn't just closed due to scandal. It had been erasing inconvenient residents for years. Children who had no families to miss them, no advocates to ask questions, no one to notice when they simply disappeared from all records. They told us we were going to new homes, the voice continued. Better places, families who wanted us, but we never left this yard. We're still here, still waiting for someone to remember our names. I found my own voice, though it came out barely a whisper. What do you want from me? Tell them, tell everyone. Make them remember that we existed, that we mattered. As the sun set completely, the lot next door transformed. The overgrown grass became a well-maintained garden. The twisted metal foundations became the walls of a large institutional building. I could see the Riverside Children's Home as it had been in its final years, a place where unwanted children disappeared into unmarked graves in the backyard. But this vision lasted only moments. As full darkness settled over the neighborhood, the lot returned to its current state of abandonment. The building faded like smoke, leaving only the rectangular depressions and the small figures who tended them like gardeners caring for a sacred space. Will you help us? The voice asked, and I could hear the hope in it. The desperate need for acknowledgement only the living could provide. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to do or how I could possibly fulfill such a promise. How do you prove the existence of children who had been systematically erased from all official records? How do you document a truth that changes every time you try to capture it? But as I knelt by the wall in my backyard, surrounded by footprints that appeared and disappeared like signatures written in water, I knew I would try. Not because I understood what was happening to me or because I could prove any of it to the outside world, but because 37 forgotten children deserve to have their stories remembered. The laughter began again, but this time it sounded different, less desperate, more hopeful, as if after decades of trying to get someone's attention, they had finally found a person willing to listen. I stay in the house now, though my friends think I've lost my mind. They point to the empty lot next door, to the city records that show no children's home ever existed here, to my inability to provide any concrete evidence of what I've experienced. They suggest therapy, medication, a change of scenery. But every afternoon at 3:47, I know the truth. I see the children playing among their forgotten graves. I hear their stories in the wind that carries their laughter over the wall. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear them moving through my house like honored guests, no longer desperate to be noticed, but content to simply be remembered. The footprints appear and disappear in my yard, spelling out names in the soft earth. Names that fade before I can photograph them, but which I carefully write down in a notebook that stays hidden from visitors. 37 names of children who existed, who mattered, who deserved better than to be erased from history by those who were supposed to protect them. I don't know if I'm documenting the truth or chronicling my own descent into madness. The evidence changes. The records shift. The footprints vanish whenever anyone else is watching. But in the growing darkness of each October evening, against every instinct, every reasonable thought, I found myself walking back toward the door. The pull was gentle but irresistible, like being led by a trusted friend into unknown territory. The afternoon was fading toward evening again, and in the growing dusk, the lot next door looked different. The overgrown grass had taken on an ethereal quality, seeming to glow with its own soft light. The figures moving among the rectangular depressions were more solid now, more present. I approached the wall and knelt beside the gap. On the other side, a small figure waited for me. Its blank face somehow conveyed infinite patience. "Look," it said, and pointed toward the settled earth beneath its feet. As I watched, the rectangular depressions began to change. The earth shifted and settled, revealing outlines unmistakably human. Child-sized forms pressed into the soil, preserved like fossils in stone. But these weren't just impressions. They were monuments. Each one marked a life forgotten by official records but remembered by the ground itself. 37, the voice said. 37 children who were never reported missing because we were already missing, already forgotten, already invisible. The truth hit me like a physical weight. The children's home hadn't just closed due to scandal. It had been erasing inconvenient residents for years. Children who had no families to miss them, no advocates to ask questions, no one to notice when they simply disappeared from all records. They told us we were going to new homes. The voice continued. Better places. Families who wanted us. But we never left this yard. We're still here, still waiting for someone to remember our names. I found my own voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What do you want from me? Tell them. Tell everyone. Make them remember that we existed, that we mattered. As the sun set completely, the lot next door transformed. The overgrown grass became a well-maintained garden. The twisted metal foundations became the walls of a large institutional building. I could see the Riverside Children's Home as it had been in its final years, a place where unwanted children disappeared into unmarked graves in the backyard. But this vision lasted only moments. As full darkness settled over the neighborhood, the lot returned to its current state of abandonment. The building faded like smoke, leaving only the rectangular depressions and the small figures who tended them like gardeners caring for a sacred space. "Will you help us?" the voice asked. I could hear the hope in it, the desperate need for acknowledgement that only the living could provide. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to do or how I could possibly fulfill such a promise. How do you prove the existence of children who had been systematically erased from all official records? How do you document a truth that changes every time you try to capture it? But as I knelt by the wall in my backyard, surrounded by footprints that appeared and disappeared like signatures written in water, I knew I would try. Not because I understood what was happening to me or because I could prove any of it to the outside world, but because 37 forgotten children deserved to have their stories remembered. The laughter began again, but this time it sounded different, less desperate, more hopeful, as if after decades of trying to get someone's attention, they had finally found a person willing to listen. I stay in the house now, though my friends think I've lost my mind. They point to the empty lot next door, to the city records that show no children's home ever existed here, to my inability to provide any concrete evidence of what I've experienced. They suggest therapy, medication, a change of scenery. But every afternoon at 3:47, I know the truth. I see the children playing among their forgotten graves, and I hear their stories in the wind that carries their laughter over the wall. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear them moving through my house like honored guests, no longer desperate to be noticed, but content to simply be remembered. The footprints appear and disappear in my yard, spelling out names in the soft earth. Names that fade before I can photograph them, but which I carefully write down in a notebook that stays hidden from visitors. 37 names of children who existed, who mattered, who deserved better than to be erased from history by those who were supposed to protect them. I don't know if I'm documenting the truth or chronicling my own descent into madness. The evidence changes, the records shift, and the footprints vanish whenever anyone else is watching. But in the growing darkness of each October evening, when the laughter drifts over the wall and the small figures tend their garden of memories, I know that some truths are too important to depend on proof. They're still here, still waiting, still hoping that someone will remember. And as long as I remain in this house, someone will. Story 4. The silence should have been my first warning. I'd been hiking the Appalachian backwoods for 15 years, and I knew the natural rhythm of these mountains. The constant whisper of wind through leaves, the distant call of hawks, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But here, following what my GPS insisted was a legitimate trail along this dried riverbed, the world had gone unnaturally quiet. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened around me. The riverbed stretched ahead like a scar through the landscape, its exposed stones bleached white by decades of flash floods and scorching summers. Ancient oaks and maples towered on either side, their canopy so dense that only fractured beams of late afternoon sunlight managed to penetrate the gloom. I'd chosen this route specifically for its isolation, a chance to disconnect from the digital chaos consuming my life back in the city. Now, 3 hours into my solitary trek, I was beginning to question that decision. My boots crunched against the dried sediment, each step releasing small puffs of dust that seemed to hang in the still air longer than physics should allow. The GPS on my phone showed I was following a legitimate hiking path, but the trail markers had vanished somewhere back near the ridge. I was beginning to suspect I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. The rational part of my mind insisted I should double back, but something deeper, some primal instinct I couldn't quite name, urged me forward. That's when I heard the first crack. It came from somewhere ahead and to my left, a sharp report that echoed off the riverbank walls like a gunshot. I froze, scanning the tree-line, but saw nothing unusual, just the towering sentinels of oak and maple, their trunks disappearing into the shadowy canopy above. After a long moment, I convinced myself it had been nothing more than a dead branch finally surrendering to gravity, a common enough sound in these old forests. I continued walking, but now my senses were heightened, every nerve ending alert for danger. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight, broken only by the soft whisper of my breathing and the rhythmic crunch of my footsteps. Then I heard it again, another crack, this one closer and unmistakably deliberate. Not the random snap of a falling branch, but something with purpose behind it. My pace quickened involuntarily, though I tried to maintain the appearance of casual hiking. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, but the riverbed behind me remained empty, stretching back into the gathering gloom like a tunnel carved from the earth itself. The afternoon sun was sinking faster than I'd anticipated, and shadows were beginning to pool in the deeper recesses of the forest. The third crack came from directly overhead. I looked up just in time to see a massive oak, easily 100 feet tall and thick as a dining room table, begin its descent toward the riverbed. There was no wind, no obvious reason for its fall. Yet down it came, with gathering momentum, its ancient trunk groaning like a wounded beast. I threw myself sideways, rolling across the rocky ground as the giant crashed down exactly where I'd been standing moments before. The impact shook the earth beneath me, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that stung my eyes and filled my lungs with the sharp taste of disturbed soil. As the dust settled, I stared at the fallen giant in disbelief. The trunk had been severed cleanly at its base, as if cut by some enormous invisible blade. The stump that remained showed no signs of disease or rot, just healthy, living wood that had somehow chosen this precise moment to surrender to gravity. I scrambled to my feet, brushing dirt from my jacket. When the fourth crack split the air, this time I was watching as it happened. Another oak, perhaps 50 yards downstream, simply toppled without warning. No wind, no visible cause. Just a sudden, deliberate collapse that sent birds I hadn't even realized were there exploding from the canopy in a panic of wings and terrified cries. The sound of their departure was the first break in the oppressive silence since I'd entered this cursed stretch of riverbed. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Drought conditions, weakening root systems, underground erosion from forgotten springs, some kind of boring beetle infestation that had hollowed out the trunks from within. But even as I cataloged these possibilities, a deeper part of my consciousness was already rejecting them. This wasn't natural. This was deliberate. The fifth tree fell behind me, cutting off my retreat. I spun around to see another massive trunk blocking the path I'd just traveled. Its fall perfectly timed to trap me in this narrow section of the riverbed. The precision was impossible to ignore now. Each tree had fallen with surgical accuracy, creating barriers that herded me forward like some kind of elaborate maze. Whatever was causing this, it wanted me to continue deeper into the forest. My heart was hammering against my ribs now, and a cold sweat had broken out across my forehead despite the warm afternoon air. I pulled out my phone, desperate for the comfort of connectivity. But the screen showed no signal, not unusual in these remote areas, but deeply unsettling given my current circumstances. The GPS was still functioning, though,